Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
So are we now China's new best friend?
Well, that's what they're saying. America won't play with them, so we've decided we're going to. There's lots of money in it. We're going to get huge oodles of billions for infrastructure, for nuclear power, and we seem to be quite happy to brush the human rights stuff under the carpet. What ministers are saying to me is that China is a big, important country with all this money, but it wants to be a sort of world citizen. It wants to be brought into the tent. It wants to play, unlike the Russians who want to just blow everything up. And if we're nice to them, perhaps we can civilise them a little and make them behave well.
It's extraordinary, though, isn't it, the lack of scrutiny that there is for some of these proposals. I mean, you're getting a Conservative government which is all the time kind of banging on about privatisation, and it doesn't want any assets in public hands. It's returned the Royal Mail to private ownership after 300 years. And then you have a deal with the Chinese state government to build our power stations, run by a French state company.
It's happy for our assets to be in government hands as long as it's not the British government.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, George Osborne recently went on this very important trip to China. Before he went there, MI6 would have come to him and they'll have said to him, don't take your iPhone, don't take your iPad. Any documents you need to discuss with your colleagues have to be on paper. And when you check into your hotel room, that nice window, that nice mirror in your room, they'll be watching you from behind that. He will have had a very, very severe security briefing. And yet he thinks it's absolutely fine for us to hand our civil nuclear power stations to the Chinese. And for George Osborne...
And the French.
And the French, yes. Watch what they're doing when they listen in. But the point is that you can't be naive about China. And for George Osborne, it is just business and there are real concerns.
Well, is it a kowtow or is it realpolitik?
Well, it's both, and I think the issue of human rights is absolutely fascinating. We're talking about Syria and the problems there. Well, we're talking about a country that is a huge human rights abuser. But there's a quote from the Chinese ambassador saying he hopes Jeremy Corbyn won't raise it at the banquet because it wouldn't be gentlemanly to do so. So I think Nick's point is exactly right. I think if you're going to deal with a country like that, then you can't feel constrained to not mention any bad things they might do.
Now, the United States, coming up, either this week or next, is sending the elite, its latest high-tech ships into the Eastern Pacific to test the Chinese there who have moved out to try and take control of the East China Sea. That's where America's coming from. It's going to be quite hard for Britain to remain America's best friend and be China's new best friend.
Well, this is part of the reason why China are talking up this new best friend thing. Even people in the Treasury admit, they were getting all this folderol when they went over there, being treated very well, patted on the head. And part of the reason for that is because George Osborne was happy to join this Asian Investment Bank, which China leads.
Yeah, which the Americans didn't
Americans were furious about this. We're told that's all been calmed down now, but by showing that we were prepared to sort of separate ourselves from America, that the Chinese like that. So that's why they're kind of emphasising.
The Chinese president's he's not getting a full Westminster Hall, both bits of parliament coming together, the way Ronald Reagan got one and others have.
And the Dalai Lama.
And Dalai Lama as well. But he is getting quite a big joint session of Parliament, I understand. Not in Westminster Hall, but in another big famous room. I think the one they took.
It's usually the Royal Gallery.
In the Royal Gallery.
Yeah.
Should the Mother of Parliaments be hosting an event for the world's biggest dictator?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty difficult to justify it. As you say, the Mother of Parliaments, seat of democracy and everything, having the President of China who's doing incredible crackdown. But the United Kingdom has decided to engage with the People's Republic of China.
Yeah.
It goes back to the Joint Declaration on Hong Kong in 1984. That is the decision that we've made. What you cannot be about it is naive. And it'll be very interesting to see how Jeremy Corbyn, will he have that white tie, how he handles himself at the state dinner. And remember, when the UK or any other government raises human rights with China, the way that is done is there's literally a box called human rights, and you literally just refer, when the Cameron meets the president, he will refer to that box, and that box is basically an official from the British Embassy in Beijing goes to the Foreign Ministry and has that human rights dialogue. And the official from the Foreign Ministry in Beijing will be the most junior official, but it allows David Cameron to say, we've raised human rights.
I don't know why no one has managed to tell the Treasury that South Korea actually builds nuclear power stations much more cheaply and on time. But that's another matter. Europe. Prime Minister tomorrow will come before the House to report on what happened at the last summit. The last summit seemed to kind of force him into having to show his hand now. But we kind of already know his hand in broad terms, and it's getting messy for him, is it not?
There's a big difference between vaguely knowing what you're going to get and actually seeing it written down on paper, which is what the European Council are forcing him to do. I mean, it was interesting to see Diana talking about Trident and going, well, that policy's out for review. I think you could say a similar thing about David Cameron's Europe negotiation. It has been a sort of shimmering mist on the horizon for a long time now, which has been very convenient for him.
Yes.
The problem comes now. Actually, we're going to see things, and there are going to be a huge amount of people who are unhappy with it. I mean, Tim, you had this story this morning about the cabinet rebels, despite the fact that Michael Fallon insists we're all Eurosceptics now. It's not necessarily true.
Is that story true?
It's absolutely true. There are people who are very concerned about it.
Well, they think they're going to be... Why would he fire them and get them outside the government when they can create all sorts of problems rather than keep them under some kind of collective responsibility, at least until the referendum campaign?
Well, that's what he, ostensibly is trying to do. But there is a lot of talk that there are people in Downing Street who think that actually, is it that bad to lose some of these people? Are they that central to the government? If we...
Who are we talking about?
Well, we're talking about Chris Grayling, Theresa Villiers, perhaps John Whittingdale in due course. There are people there who are not necessarily part of core.
But
Cameron.
why would you get rid of them now?
Well, I'm not saying he's going to do that. All I'm reporting is that there are people in the government who think that is what might happen. Downing Street are, of course, denying it. But there's also evidence that he's kicking Eurosceptic rebels off a parliamentary delegation to the Council of Europe. And when you start getting unsolicited phone calls saying, this is what we think is happening, and the position is hardening, it's worth reporting. The other thing that's going on is that, as Helen was saying, what he's actually going to offer is dwindling fast, and there are people in the cabinet who are very concerned about that. There's some a report by the No campaign this morning that effectively says he's promised 24 things, 14 have already gone, and of the remaining 10, 7 would require a treaty change, which he isn't going to get.
Which you can't get in time.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting about this is you can see why David Cameron wants to hug the ministers now, but maybe give them a bit of freedom once you've got that agreement. But do you really want to have all those people outside the cabinet when what he is going to get is going to be so modest? And the big thing that he's been talking about in the last year is imposing this 4-year ban on EU migrants claiming in-work benefits. It looks like they're not going to be able to get that in the negotiations. The only hope they're going to get it is that there have been a couple of European Court of Justice judgments that have gone the way of the UK on those benefits, and what they're hoping is that you would codify those in some sort of directive, but you're not going to get that round the table. So what he's going to get is going to be a promissory note, because there will be no treaty change before these negotiations.
No.
And you really want Chris Grayling, Ian Duncan-Smith, Theresa Villiers outside the cabinet saying this is a piffling change, this is back to the New Zealand butter that Harold Wilson got in 1974, that would be unwise.
For those of us who took the New Zealand butter, it was a major cut through, I think. You're right. You're right. Harold Wilson got almost nothing, but he still won. He won by 2-1 for us to stay in 1975, though different days. The problem, it would seem to me now, is not just that there's a widespread expectation among Tory Eurosceptics that Cameron will bring back nothing good enough. It's worse than that. They're already saying, of course he's not going to bring anything worth having, because he's not asking for anything worth having in the first place.
But it is very difficult for him at the time when there is such gridlock over Syrian refugees and resettlement thereof to kind of pop up in the back and go, I'd like to talk about treaty change in a couple of years. The one to watch, I think, is Boris in all this, because he is kind of sitting on that fence with, flirting with either side, but he could be a big thorn.
But his strategy in trouble, because what he quite liked was this idea put forward by Dom Cummings, who's the brains behind the Leave campaign, which is that the vote that we have in this referendum is not a definitive rupture, because there'll have to be another negotiation under the departure, and you have a second referendum. When they change the wording of the referendum, the no people are Leave, and what Boris Johnson doesn't want is to be definitively part of a rupture. He'd quite like to tango some way with the no people, but of a definitive rupture, that's too difficult for him.
OK, well, I hope when he tangos, he's less dangerous than he was with that little Japanese rugby player. Didn't do much for Anglo-Japanese relations, that, did it? Anyway, that's it for today. The Daily Politics is back at midday tomorrow. We'll be back here again tomorrow. Not tomorrow, Sunday, that is. See, time flies quickly when you're having fun. 11 o'clock next Sunday. Remember, if it's Sunday, it is the Sunday Politics.